Hello, welcome to Gardener's World, and welcome back to Longmeadow. It's been a month, and in that month the garden has grown a lot. And although for us gardeners it's been a pretty miserable summer so far, wet and cold, actually for the garden it means it's been well watered and mild. We haven't had to cope with the extremes of heat, and as a result I don't think I've ever seen Longmeadow look so lush. And as we come to the end of July, we are moving into another season. That exuberance of growth that you get in May and June and the very beginning of July, which is caused by the extra light and heat, is being replaced by a kind of maturity. And that can begin to look tired. So now's the time to start thinking of freshening the garden up, particularly if you're going away on holiday. So when you come back, it's not looking completely overgrown. And one of the ways of doing this is to give hedges a light trim. It's too early for a major hedge cut because there are still birds that are nesting and young that haven't yet fledged. But a light trim, particularly if it's an evergreen or edging hedge like this yew one in the dual garden, will just sharpen everything up. And that means that the lushness of the growth within it and around it looks all the better. On today's programme, Carol continues to share her expertise on growing plants for free.
I know it looks a bit brutal, but it's all for the good of the new plants that we're making. Oh, look at that. 2 for the price of 1.
We meet a gardener in Lancashire who has discovered the many joys of growing and showing sweet peas.
I get so much enjoyment and pleasure from sweet peas. I started 7 years ago when I took early retirement, and I thought, well, it'll give me something to do, and since then it's just taken over.
Adam visits an Italian-inspired garden in Devon to meet the team who are bringing this fascinating story back to life.
I'm just trying to get my head around this. This garden is totally and utterly hidden away, and I need to find out why.
And I shall be sowing salad seeds for an autumn harvest. The big change last autumn here in the cottage garden was taking out the very established box hedge and also avenue of espaliered pears that have been here for 30 years. Really the thing that I'm trying to do now as we move into high summer is to keep the change going through the planting. And one of the main objectives of everything I've done this year here in the cottage garden is to extend the season. Now the roses have had their day. So the burden of display has to be on other plants. And you can see we've got sweet peas, we've got cosmos, we've got phlox, and we've got these geraniums. This is a geranium called blue cloud. It is really one of the biggest geraniums you can get and absolutely perfect for in here. But in order to keep it flowering, I need to cut it back a bit. And I know that can feel counterintuitive, but it really at this time of year, you do need to be thinking about that. So for example, we've got good flowering here. But down below, this is a mass of seed heads, and the plant will be putting more energy into the production of seeds than it will flowers. So if I leave those, gradually we'll get fewer and fewer flowers and just a load of seed heads. So I'm going to cut those off, and that will mean that this should flower well into September, if not October. So we go in here and just cut fairly indiscriminately. Now, I've got a space there which I could pot some annuals in, but what I've got here are some perennials that are going to go too big for the very front of the border, but I've got another spot where they'll be ideal. I've got a tray of phlox. This is a variety called Bright Eyes. It's got a pale pink outer petals and then a really strong, lurid pink to the inner. And you can see here, this is one of the older borders, where it's a little bit thin. So I'm going to beef it up. Now, at the moment, obviously, these are small plants, but they will grow to about 3-4 foot tall. And the great thing about phlox, they are late summer flowers. They'll grow in most soils and most conditions, although they do need ideally at least half a day of sunshine, so don't put them on a north-facing wall. So I'm going to place them first. I want in here, I'm going to place, I can put one there, and I could put these in groups of 3 to get a really strong display. Right, let's get these in the ground. I'll plant the rest of this tray out and I will give them a good soak. And I would stress that whenever you plant, but particularly in summer, even if it's rained that morning, even if you know it's going to rain tonight or tomorrow, give them a good water when you plant them. Not only does it give them a drink, but it also firms the soil around the roots, and they should give you pleasure for years to come. Now, while I'm planting, we're going to go to join Carol in her garden in Devon for another of her masterclasses in producing plants for free.
This year, I've been growing loads and loads of plants for free. Now, whether you're an experienced gardener or you're just beginning, I hope there've been lots of things to learn, lots of tips to pick up on the way. We've grown stuff from seed, we've divided plants, and we've taken loads and loads of cuttings. So this is my little bed where I'm actually going to plant lots of the things that I'm growing from seed division and cuttings over the summer. Already it's beginning to fill in. So the heleniums that we divided have started to flower. They're probably a bit shorter than they would be in the garden, but really good healthy plants. The cosmos is doing fine too. I planted some of it in a big pot as well. Now, this is just to show that even if you've just got a balcony or a small courtyard, you can still grow loads of your own plants and make a wonderful display. All the things in this pot were grown from seed, but today I'm going to show you an entirely different way of making plants for free. And it's all about what happens underground. This is like my nature table at school. Let me introduce you to a few of these things. You know all of them already. So I suppose the most familiar is probably the bearded iris with these great big rhizomes. And very closely related to that are gingers, but you can grow new plants from it too. And then there are crocosmias, which make little new combs on top of their old ones. And there are bulbs. These are the tulips from this spring. And look, already they're dividing themselves and making more. And of course, although this is all about plants for free, with very many of these plants, you actually start by having to buy them. But then they multiply and you help them on their way and make masses and masses more plants. Come on, thief! Fifi! Come on, come on, come on, that's it. Nice to get out of the rain. Now you might think, well, it's far too late to plant lilies, but it's not at all. They'll flower in between 8 and 12 weeks. So even if you put your lilies in now, you'll get some flower, but it's a really easy way of making more. Now this is a giant lily called Robina, but this is a much smaller one. And look what it's done. It's actually made loads and loads of these little bulbils. And if you look carefully, they're still attached to one of the scales that's actually come from the bulb. And this is exactly what we want these scales to do. So I've already got a flying start with those. So the very first thing we want to do is to detach a few of these scales. And as close to the base, just take it off like that. Let's do this big fat one too. Lovely crunchy sound there. Yeah, absolutely brilliant. I think that's enough of that one. Vermiculite in the bag, in go the scales. Now, I'm going to find a nice, warm, dark place for it to live for the next few weeks, possibly a couple of months. And then when they're a decent size, they're not going to be huge, I'll actually take them out, plant the whole scale and the little bulbil into a tray of really good potting compost. And then you can just grow them on in full light. And eventually they'll become the size of the sort of bulbs you can buy. But it'll take probably 2 or 3 years before you actually get flowering sized bulbs. But, you know, that's what it's all about, isn't it? It's so exciting to watch it through all these different stages. Lilies have this real special significance for me, because when we got married, I didn't have a bouquet. I was driving past a house in South Molton, and in the garden were these beautiful lilies. It was Speciosum rubrum, gorgeous pink reflex lilies with lots of spots on them. And I jumped out of the car, put the handbrake on first, and I knocked on the door and asked this bloke if there was any chance of actually buying some of these lilies, and he immediately, when I'd told him what they were for, came out with his secateurs, cut all the stems and handed them to me. All he got in exchange was a slice of wedding cake and my eternal thanks. It was the best bouquet anybody's ever had. This is just root ginger that you can buy in any supermarket. All you do is just push this so it's in absolute intimate contact with this nice gritty compost underneath. And then you just put some grit around it just to make sure that it doesn't rot and it stays firmly in place. Once this is watered, put it in a warm, bright place, and you're going to find they'll get leaves growing from here. Look at this one. Can you see? It's already started to make a little new shoot here. And as soon as you put it in contact with the soil, that hastens that. It's going to send down roots into the compost and send up shoots. And before you know it, you'll have these great, big, majestic leaves. But the thing I want to show you next is grown for its very glamorous, voluptuous flowers. This is the best kind of plants for free. It's a huge clump of bearded iris that a friend's given me. You know, Iris was actually the goddess of the rainbow, so they come in all sorts of colours. Sadly, in this garden, because we've got very heavy clay, there are only a few spots where I can grow them, and this is one of them. The soil here is really well drained, it's in full sun, and all I'm going to do is create a ridge across here. At the same time, I will also be making 2 trenches. Now, the reason you plant these rhizomes on a ridge is you want the rhizome itself to actually bake in the sun. You really need it to get the full input of the sunshine, because that ripens the rhizome and enables it to produce lots of those gorgeous flowers. Now, this is a perfect time to do it after they've finished flowering, and leave a few weeks after that, because by that time all the goodness from these leaves will have started to sink back into the rhizomes. And all I want to do now is pull this apart. It's coming up reasonably easily, and I'm getting lots of pieces. Now you can see there, this is the really old stuff here. That's almost squidgy too. Whereas you can see the new roots here. So I'll actually break that off there and then. I know it looks a bit brutal, but it's all for the good of the new plants that we're making. Look at that. 2 for the price of 1. The reason I cut back those leaves is because, as my mum would say, they're neither use nor ornament. In fact, they'll make it use energy that it ought to be using to make lots and lots more roots. Another reason for cutting the leaves back, it stops any kind of windrock. It's pretty sheltered here anyway. And this was a great big congested clump. You can tell it hadn't been split for years and years, but hopefully now we're not just making more plants for free, but we're also reinvigorating this plant. And with a bit of luck, next year I'll have my own little Monty garden right here amongst the peas and the beetroot.
Good boy, come on. Out you come. There's a good boy. Well done. I love the way that Carol embraces the natural speed of growth. We're all trying to hurry and get things done so quickly, but if you can tune into that, it seems to me a real celebration of the rhythms of nature. It may seem a little bit early, but actually now is time to start sowing for your autumn and even winter salad crops. Now I've got here 3 different types. We've got Oriental Ruby Streaks, which is a kind of mustard, lovely purple leaves, nice hot flavour which gets hotter as they get bigger. I've got a mixture which just calls itself Winter Greens, which says it has Mitsuna, Komatsuna, Pak Choi, mustard, and then green baraku. In other words, mainly Oriental greens, which you broadcast and then cut and come again, rather than growing them individually. And I've also got one of our favourites, which is lamb's lettuce. And I'm going to grow them partly by sowing in a seed tray and partly in plugs. I'm going to start with a seed tray. So, compost, and this is for the lamb's lettuce, which I will sow here, and when they're big enough to prick out, I will move on into modules. And if we just sprinkle that on the surface, and it's always worth taking trouble to try and spread them evenly, and just gently press them down so there's good contact with the compost, then cover them over lightly. And I'm going to use vermiculite, but you could use more compost or grit if you've got it. Spread that out. There you go, a label. It doesn't need heat to germinate. I will put that in the greenhouse, but if you haven't got a greenhouse, it can just sit outside and wait to germinate, which will take about 3 weeks or so. Salad leaves, the winter greens, which you can broadcast, can also be sown in modules, and then plant the modules out evenly spaced, and that does give you healthier, stronger plants. So I just put a little pinch with 2, 3 or 4 seeds in each one. They could be all the same, they could be a mixture, but that doesn't matter because they're all going to be planted out together. And I'm just going to, with my fingers, push them in gently and very lightly cover them over with a sprinkle of more compost. And that gives you a light covering. I will put these into the greenhouse, give them a good water, obviously keep them watered but not saturated, and they should be ready to prick out or move on in about 3 to 4 weeks' time, and then ready to plant out in a further 3 to 4 weeks. So we're looking at September. And if I do another sowing in a few weeks' time, that will give me supplies that will take me actually not just till Christmas, but right through the winter. Now, last summer, we went up to Chorley in Lancashire to visit a gardener who, on her retirement, discovered a passion for sweet peas.
I get so much enjoyment and pleasure from the perfume of the sweet peas, from the delicacy of the forms, from looking at them. I grow sweet peas here on the allotment and I grow them at home. I started 7 years ago when I took early retirement and I thought, well, it'll give me something to do, and since then it's just taken over. My name's Carol Tate and I love growing sweet pea flowers. I used to be a bank manager, so this is completely different. I live here by myself. My son lives next door, so he's not into gardening, so I borrow his garden. So I've actually got some plants over that side as well. Do you want to come through and have a look? Yeah, if you want to come through. I've got various varieties. I've got the old-fashioned, I've got the Spencers, and I've got the species and some perennials. At home I have a raised bed that I grow some of the Spencers in and some of the old-fashioned. Over here I've got my species growing in tubs. To keep them flowering, I keep nipping off the peas. I'm coming along in the morning, I tidy them up, try and control them a little bit, keep them growing up. This is an example of a good sweet pea. It's got 1, 2, 3, 4 flowers on the stem, nice long straight stem, evenness of colour, uniformity, there's no gapping, there's no bunching, so that's a good sweet pea. So if I can get 7 of those in a vase, that's what wins me the prizes. I really enjoy the competitions. So it's good that it brings local people together at the local shows to admire the sweet pea flower. Here on the allotment, I've got some friends together, half a dozen of us came down. We cleared all the brambles, we cleared all the weeds. So we've all taken turns in planting and putting up the structures, bringing in compost, bringing in bark chippings to put on the floor. So from nothing, we've created the allotment we've got behind us. We've got the old-fashioned, which are the original ones. The Sicilian monk called Cupani sent seeds over in 1699. That's the first recording of sweet peas in the UK. In the late 1800s, Henry Eckford started to develop them, and they became known as the Eckford grandifloras. They've got the perfume and the fragrance. Then at the turn of the century in 1900s, some of them sported, mutated, and became bigger and flowerier. They became known as the Spencers. I've got various old-fashioned species. This one is Edward of York. The white one is Dorothy Eckford. And we've got Painted Lady. On this side we've got species. We've got the Tingitanus, which is climbing away nicely. This is one called Mrs. Arpenny. Then we've got one called Hotham Red. Then this blue one, Latherus sativus azurus. I love this one, this is one of my favourites. Seeds of this were found in Tutankhamun's tomb. It was used as a fodder crop for the animals in the afterlife. So it's been going for thousands of years. They like a neutral pH soil. They like lots of manure because they're annuals, so a lot of goodness. They need plenty of water, they like well-drained soil and sunshine, but not too much. The perfume, it reminds me of my childhood. My dad used to grow them on the allotment, and so I love sitting there with the fragrance. It's a reason to get up and go out in the garden to do things and to become involved with other people, meet other people, and the competitiveness. I enjoy competing against other people.
I can't claim to have anything like Carol's expertise and devotion to sweet peas. And I think that anybody who exhibits them has an incredible attention to detail. But for most of us, growing sweet peas is a delicious way of providing cut flowers for the house. I think sweet peas make the best cut flowers you can possibly grow. The fragrance is beyond compare. They look lovely. This is a variety called Kupani, one of the oldest types, and they're just beautiful. This is a really good year for sweet peas. Cool, wet, and they love it. And if you keep picking them, they keep producing flowers. If you're going away on holiday, by the way, pick the lot. Pick every single flower. Don't leave one. Because if you do when you come back, all the ones you will have left will become seed pods. And once they get the momentum of going to seed, it's really hard to reverse that. But if the weather stays cool and slightly damp, we should have bunches of these wonderful fragrant sweet peas in the house for another couple of months to come. Now, still to come on today's programme. Adam discovers an historic Mediterranean-inspired garden in Devon that's being restored to its former glory.
You get the sense that this group not only understand the past and the creation of this garden, but they've really got hold of it and they want to move that legacy forward.
And we explore a beautiful garden in Surrey that's made the most of its tricky sloping position.
It's where I get my creative part of my life from. If I didn't have the garden, then I would have to find another creative bit to stop me going mad.
And I'd have to move to find somewhere with a garden.
But first, we're going to visit one of your gardens. It belongs to John Wilshire in Sussex.
My name's John. I live in Linfield in West Sussex, and we moved here in 2016. So this was a new build house, and it was by and large a wildlife desert. Everything had been turfed. You know what it's like when you move into a new house. The first things that you do are sort the inside and so on. We didn't really do that much with the gardening. My friend Rob was involved in a project called My Nature Watch Camera, which is essentially build your own wildlife camera, which was great because we'd young kids, great thing to do, put it out in the garden. So we got this kit, we built it, put the camera together, put it outside. No birds, nothing. And I realised it's all like the whole estate was built the same way that our garden had been built. So everything was barren. There was no real places for the birds to travel over from different woods over there or parks over there. So I started thinking about, okay, so what you have to do to rewild a garden so that you can actually get birds. Birds want cover. So we looked at the borders and the, kind of like the walls and the pillars and so on, thought, how do we start introducing more cover for birds to hide in? Secondly, we didn't just want to continually be feeding birds bird food, we wanted them to sort of feed on other things. Insects, pond life, whatever else and so on. But we didn't have a pond, so we made a pond. Our first pond was using an old washing up basin. So once the frogs were there and once some other things were there, suddenly we started getting damselflies and dragonflies. But increasing that sort of little corner of diversity in the garden allows other things to work for the birds, with the birds. Thirdly, we started thinking about putting some bird boxes up. So out the front, just in amongst some Boston Ivy, we have a bird box which we've had great tits in for the last 2 years. So I sit here in my office, often watching the garden and the birds, and how could house developers make this easier for people? It's taken us 7 years. So the first thing I think is only clear the land when you need it, when you're about to build on it. So all out the front was just scraped away and nothing was done with it for about a year. The second thing is make boundaries between plots and areas permeable for nature. So we've got big brick walls sealing in, it's hermetically sealed our back garden. The third thing, just at a garden level, is not to turf everything. Don't just put grass from wall to wall, from fence to fence. Give people borders to start off with and then start giving them ideas about what to plant in them. So maybe that's the fourth thing. It's all things that I don't think are that hard, but actually could have a really big benefit for nature on estates like this and everyone who lives here.
John is absolutely right. It really wouldn't take much to create a garden on a new build that has the bones and the beginnings of something that is really good for wildlife and for gardeners. A border or two and some plants and you're away. But there's no question that the best thing of all is to have a pond. When we made this pond about 10 years ago, almost within days, you really noticed the difference. There were more insects. More insects meant more bats, more birds, mammals coming down to drink, birds bathing. The whole cycle of life was enlarged and enriched. Although I have to say this year, there's a real absence because the frogs spawned, as they normally do, late February, early March, and then we had another of the series of big floods that we had all winter, and all that frog spawn was washed away. So we had no tadpoles this year at all, which means we're right down on frogs, and we're right down on insects, and we're right down on butterflies too. However, we're not right down on plant growth. But that brings a horticultural factor that you have to deal with, because when things are growing strongly, it's always the thugs that win. There may be beautiful thugs, but thugs they are. And here's a really good example. Now you can see here, we've got the lovely shuttlecock fern, Matutia, and we've got lots of hostas. But the shuttlecock fern, which loves damp, is spreading too strongly. I wanted it just to be a sort of counterpoint with its feathery, ferny, upright foliage to the spread of the sort of fat leaves of the hostas. However, the hostas are not competing so well. And what's really interesting is where you see the hostas that have been covered over by the fern, it's being eaten by slugs. And this year has been a really bad year for slugs, but by and large, my hostas are untouched. If you look, on the whole, they're pretty good. That's because slugs and snails will always go for a plant that's stressed before one that's healthy. So what I'm going to do is cut back the fern, thin it out, and then later in the year I will dig them up and move them. And that will give more light and air and more room for the hostas, and then maybe I'll fill the gaps with more hostas. Now if we come in here, there we go. I think this is getting better. I can start to see the hostas. They're seeing more light and air, and they should grow better, which means that if they're stronger and healthier, they're much less likely to be attacked by slugs and snails. Now, that doesn't mean to say that I don't like or don't want the shuttlecock fern, but sometimes you just have to accept that two plants you thought would look great side by side just can't coexist happily. And you, as a gardener, have to step in, make decisions, and just rejig. But personally, I find that's part of the pleasure of gardening. Now we're going to go to Surrey to visit the garden of Vivian and David Murch, who created a garden from what was initially a very unpromising site.
For me, it's a bit of an escape. I just get lost in it. I come out and play here. Play with the plants, play with the colours, and it just makes me feel happy.
What Vivian's done here is amazing, really. Out of nothing has created this oasis of calm and colour.
We came to the garden in '96. The first present that David gave me when we arrived here was some baby pickaxes and a shovel. And really it took a lot of work to actually dig down to get anything in, because it was just flint underneath, chalk. It's not very easy to actually get plants to establish flints like that. The garden is on a slope and it can be quite challenging at times, particularly if it is very steep, and we have got areas like that.
As we developed the garden, we added more and more of our own compost and soil. So we built up levels so the soil wasn't running away, and we added a little bit of terracing in strategic points so that it retained the soil in areas that were running away faster. The drop between the terraces hardly noticeable because we've got plants in front of those, so you can't actually see the terracing at all.
If you put larger plants in the front, that actually makes it seem flatter if you're looking at it. So it's a bit of an optical illusion you can create, which we've tried to do particularly in the cottage area. The garden itself is divided up into 3 sections, which represent different types of soil and different types of condition. In the front, it tends to be drier. Then as you come into this part of the garden, this is more of a cottage garden feel.
Having wildlife around us and in the garden was fundamental to the development of everything we did. So this is our wildlife area, or bee and butterfly garden. We also have a large amount of birds that come in here. We have a pond just up in the corner. We have allium heads that are just great because they look fantastic earlier in the summer, and the bees absolutely love them.
What I like about this particular spot in the garden is from here I think you can see the plants that I've really fallen in love with over the last few years. You've got the roses, you've got the delphiniums, you've got the clematis. I just like the way that it tends to flow and the colours change. We're really fortunate because in our garden we can get some pretty substantial delphiniums going. We mulch them really well, which I think helps, but they obviously do like the soil. They are also very hardy plants that are not susceptible to things like frost. They can be susceptible to things like slugs. One of the things you have to watch for, particularly if you want to keep the varieties true, is that you deadhead at the right time. Now this delphinium here is beginning to go to seed, so what I would do is I would actually cut it here, but also what it will now do is you will get hopefully a second flush of flowers from the delphiniums. They won't be as tall as the first flush. When you really think that they've had enough and they need their sleep, because they do need a period of dormancy, you'd take them right the way to the base of the plant. And then what I do is actually I make sure I mulch it in the autumn, and I also mulch it again in the spring and put some fertiliser on so that it gets a good start in life. And then if they're happy, they will do marvellous things for you. On this side of the garden, it is a lot damper and also it's a lot shadier because we have the trees. So what I've chosen to do is really have a cooler palette here, which tends to work better. So you have the pink and the blue campanulas, the light blue delphiniums, you have the variegated cornus, and in the front you have some roses and astrantia. And it works quite well with the white clematis behind, with just the picking up the blue in the corner. So this area here is what we call our dry gravel garden. We were really inspired by Beth Chatto's garden, where she just took a piece of car park and just turned it into a gravel garden. So we thought we'd try and replicate that and find out what plants we could grow in the same sort of medium, which is just solid chalk, flint, nothing else underneath. So we've got the hemerocallis here, we've got agapanthus that are coming through, and salvias. I know quite a lot of people this year have actually lost salvias because it was so wet and cold in the winter, but we found that because this is such a free-draining area, we found that they survive very well. So we don't feed this area at all. We give them a good water to begin with, and then literally we let them get on with it. For me, it's where I get my creative part of my life from. If I didn't have the garden, then I would have to find another creative bit to stop me going mad.
And I'd have to move to find somewhere with a garden.
I love the connection that Vivian is making between playing in the garden, saying I go outside to play with colour, play with plants, and also this realisation that that's a form of creativity. Now, what I've got here are beds of cut flowers. These are dahlias on this side, and we've got cornflowers and ammi, just destined to be picked. I'm deadheading these to keep that production of flowers going. And when you're deadheading dahlias, there's just two things to look for. Is the shape of a spent flower is very different to the shape of a bud that hasn't yet opened. So, for example, here we go. Now, obviously, that's got the petals on it, so you can see. But if I took the petals off, you can see that it's elongated. Some of them are distinctly conical. Some of them are more tubular. But what they aren't is round, whereas this, for example, a bud about to open is nice and round. So that's how you know. And as always, when you're deadheading, don't just take the flower off, go right down to something, a leaf, another bud, and that will produce more flowers. You may remember that back in March, I planted 4 step-over pears to go with the step-over apples that we've got here in the vegetable garden. Now, step-over simply means that the whole tree is trained horizontally, which means that you can line a path or grow a really good crop in a small space. And now's the time to summer prune them. And if you've not done this before, it can feel very counterintuitive, because this is a good example. You have a really healthy, strong, vertical leader. Every tree wants to produce a leader that will grow vertically up, good and strong. And that's what you have to suppress, because all growth wants to be horizontal. So, the upright growth here, cut right back. Cut to about 4 leaves is a good rule. So I'm going to cut this to there and just take that off. And then this one here can come off. And then this one too, we take that off. This pruning is formative. In other words, you just do enough to lead it in the direction you want until it's established. But once it's established, you will have to prune every summer. And summer pruning has a very different role to winter pruning. And there's a really good example here on these stepovers. Because when you prune in summer, you restrict growth. When you prune in winter, you encourage growth. So simply take it all right back, and you can see the fruit in there growing. So I'm cutting in, just leaving a little spur. And the whole business of spurs is, when you've got new growth like this, you can see it's clean and there's nothing growing on it. But once you start to get those knobbly side shoots, the spurs, that's what produces the fruit. So you can see the general outline that's appearing. We're still keeping a cover of leaves, but the fruit are much more visible, and that means that because they're more visible, they're more exposed to light and heat, which means that they will ripen quicker and perhaps better. So that helps. But also what's left behind is wood that can mature and develop spurs and therefore produce more fruit. We don't want to go right back down and remove that, otherwise we're going to have to wait a few years until that gets ready to fruit. And then in winter, what you do is remedial pruning. So anything that's damaged, is too weak or crossing or going in the wrong direction, then you take that out then. I'll finish pruning this and the other stepovers, but we're going to join Adam now as he continues his journey visiting gardens that need renewal or restoration. This week he's in the southwest, and the garden that he's going to visit has a fascinating story.
I can see Dartmoor in the distance. I am in deep Devonshire countryside. Would you believe me if I told you there's an incredible garden restoration going on just here, with more than a hint of the Mediterranean? I've come to the Great Ambrook Estate. Back in 1909, the then owners created a garden in the middle of this woodland. Over time, it fell into disrepair, buried under ivy and brambles. But that has all changed. . wasn't expecting that. It's wow. Literally feel like you've walked into some movie. Definitely got an Italian edge to it. Come up here, see what we can find. It looks like the whole thing is walled and you've got these wonderful paths going off in different directions. I've driven down lane after lane after lane to get here. So even thinking about how you build something like this. And then look a little bit closer, and there's a ginkgo sitting in there. You are surrounded by gems. That is a quercus suber, which is the corco. Not the sort of thing I would imagine seeing in a Devonshire countryside. I'm just trying to get my head around this. This garden is totally and utterly hidden away. And I need to find out why. For the last 8 years, this hidden Italianate garden has been slowly uncovered by a team of dedicated volunteers, guided by the vision of owner Stephanie Berry. Take me back to when you first walked in. What was it like?
When we first walked in, you couldn't see through, really. Everything green was covered in brambles, the palms here, old man's beard climbing up them, brambles underneath, a lot of self-seeded trees, so it was a lot darker.
1909, the first owners, what can you tell me about them?
Arthur Graham was the owner, a wealthy man. He was gay at a time when it was illegal to be gay in the 1900s. So we think he wanted a place where he could be himself in privacy. So clearly the whole space was designed for entertainment, a garden with a swimming pool, a pergola, a plunge pool, where he could invite his friends and entertain in privacy.
Why do you think Italian?
I think because at that time he was wealthy. He would have travelled a lot to Europe, was the thing, to go on the grand tours and visit Italy. So I think he just wanted to bring back a little bit of what he'd seen and have a special place he could afford it.
And the acanthus, original?
The acanthus was certainly here when we bought the garden, but buried, so we've done mostly clearing.
So all these paths lead to
the dell, which is the central feature of the garden, and we believe deliberately designed around this because it is quite a spectacular feature. The ferns we've encouraged through the weeding to stay because they look great. We've planted now the ground cover, the geraniums, campanulas, to try and keep the weeds at bay and build a sort of alpine type garden, really. And when we arrived, it was completely filled in.
So how did you got back clearing that?
We have an amazing team of volunteers.
Hello, Carol.
Hello.
You all right?
Yes, fine, thank you.
Hey. This is a magical place to come and spend a few hours,
It is lovely, isn't it, on a day like this, especially, yes.
What did you first think when you saw it?
Oh, couldn't believe it. It is just beautiful. I mean, it must have been amazing to have been in right at the beginning. But it is, no, it's very special, very lovely.
Restoring this garden is also about a safe haven for wildlife. But for Katie Wilkinson from Devon Wildlife Trust, well, she was also captured by the human story of this secluded place. It seems bizarre to have to move to deepest, darkest Devon just to live as the person you want to be.
Being a gay woman myself, it allowed me to reflect back on, you know, that history, you know, where he came from and where we are now. I met Stephanie a couple of years ago now. She told me about their plans and how they wanted to really be intentional with their planting so that it's wildlife friendly. So for me, I was like, great, you know, we can actually do some wildlife gardening workshops and intentionally invite the LGBTQ plus community to those workshops.
Gardens are about people.
Yeah.
You know, and this is, in one sense, a very personal garden. Stephanie has asked me to lend a hand today with a new border near the summer house. So we need to get some key plants in place. What says Italy to you?
We're thinking impactful,
Yeah.
flamboyant, Mediterranean, something that's going to like the sun. We've got phlomis, we've got sedum, crocosmia that we've already got in the North Walk.
So
Nice
you've got that
repetition as we come up.
connection, yeah. The things that you're talking about, you said the crocosmia, you straight away put that without, you know it's going to work, and that's before it even flowers. You've got that sort of soft sheen, and then if you add that as well,
Yeah,
that looks quite nice,
that
doesn't
looks
it?
good.
And do you know
yeah.
what? I think phlomis is totally underrated in the sense that
I agree. Yeah.
don't cut it back, and you're going to have sort of interest right through the winter. Right. When I was taught at college, no, all joking aside, when I was taught, I was taught 3s, 5s, 7s, 9s.
Yeah.
And actually think about it, herbaceous plants,
Doesn't
in
matter.
12 months' time, you won't know whether that's 4, 5, 10. So actually, I now work on sort of space and think, well, I need about a square metre, and then I'll balance out with a square metre of something.
Yep.
So you might say, well, actually, sedum will go there.
Phlomis somewhere near the crocosmia, the yellow and the red would be nice.
In a group here?
I think so. So, Jane, you've been volunteering here from more or less the beginning as well?
Yeah, day one. I was here day one. So I'd been working in the NHS. When I moved down here, I actually wanted to find a volunteering role because I wanted to carry on with that kind of like public service sort of thing. But then working with such a fantastic team of volunteers and in such an amazing garden. It's something about actually being with nature. It's something about being with the group of people we've actually got here. But I also think it's something about the reason for this garden.
I talk a lot about gardens being about space, place, plants and people. Space-wise, it's still really well laid out. There's a central feature and there's lots of movement all the way around. Place, even though it's Italianate, it feels comfortable in its landscape. Plants, there are some incredibly beautiful trees here. And then it comes to the people. And you get the sense that this group not only understand the past and the creation of this garden, but they've really got hold of it and they want to move that legacy forward. And I think they will.
It's completely fascinating to see not just the garden appear from the brambles and the overgrown trees, but also the story behind it. Now this bed I planted up with new potatoes in spring. It's a variety called Foremost, which I haven't grown before, and these are first early, so you would normally expect to harvest them, well, as soon as possible, but this year, because of the rain, I could have harvested them in mid-June, so it's time to dig them up. Now, when you're digging potatoes, the first thing you need to be aware of is not spiking too many with your fork. Go down by the side of the plant and then gently lever up. And there you are, they're not far below the surface. And you can see they're pretty big. And that's because these were probably ready to eat, as I say, about a month ago, and also because it's been so wet and the water has swollen them. So that's big for a new potato. Pull off the tops like that. See this? These are the sort of size we'd normally expect to get. There you are. That's what always happens. With the best will in the world, you end up spearing a spud. But that'll be edible. It just won't keep, so we'll eat that very quickly. I've got quite a lot to clear here, so rather than just sitting watching me work, it's your turn now. Here are your jobs for the weekend. Come on. Go. Homemade comfrey tea is one of the best liquid fertilizers that you can have. So if you've got comfrey plants, pick them, chop them up, stem, leaves, flowers and all. fill a container as full as it will go, and then top that up with water until it's full. Put this mixture somewhere out of the way, cover it, and then whilst you're on holiday, the smelliest part of the process should be done. And then when you come back after another 2 or 3 weeks, it will be ready for use. If you're growing plants that need a good supply of water and you're going away for a week or two, give them a really good soak and follow that with a thick mulch. We tend to think of mulch as something you just do in spring, but at any time of year, it's one of the best ways of making sure that water doesn't evaporate and it all goes where it's needed to the roots of the plant. If you grow courgettes, you'll know that at this time of year, they grow so fast that the time between being too small to eat and too big to enjoy is a matter of days. So if you're going away, pick any that are remotely edible, and if you can't eat them yourselves, share them with friends and neighbours. When you come home, the very tiny fruits should be the perfect size for harvesting. I don't often wear gloves for gardening unless it's very prickly or toxic. And actually I'm going to wear a glove for this because this is a euphorbia, Euphorbia coraceus. And like all euphorbias, it has a sort of latex sap, which is a real irritant to skin. And the spent flowers should be cut back now. It's like everything at this time of year. A bit of cutting back now will make sure that flowering later will be better. In this case, I'm not going to flower this year, it's next spring. Springtime, you get that incredible, vibrant, luminescent, yellowy green from them. So the secret is not just to deadhead them, but go right down to the base if you possibly can. Got quite a few here. So if I go down in like that, and that, I will take these out and you can see that that white latex is starting to flow, and it's that is the irritant. So you want to keep that off your skin. Now, while I'm doing this, I'm very aware that I'm in the flight path of honeybees that have taken up residence in the wall of the building above the window, and I'm not very happy about me being here. But I'm happy that they've decided to share the house with us. That is a privilege and a treat. I love the idea of the walls filling up with honey. That's it for this week. I'll see you back here at Longmeadow at 8 o'clock next Friday. So until then, bye-bye.